Good afternoon, everybody. This is the Bob Unger Show. We're very privileged to have a very interesting guest who's written an interesting book that covers issues I've been thinking about for many years. His name is Ivan Eland. Is that the proper pronunciation, or Eland?
Eland, yeah.
Okay. I tried to give you a little French feel there.
There you go.
And his book is called War and the Rogue Presidency, Restoring the Republic After Congressional Failure. Failure is an understatement. So give us a quick synopsis of the premises of your book, and then we'll get into the details.
Well, the original conception of the founders, we have three branches of the government at the federal level, and that's, checks and balances. And then that's the horizontal diffusion of power, supposedly. And then you've got your vertical diffusion of power between the federal government and the state governments. And in that scheme, originally, founders intended the Congress to be, at the federal level, the Congress to be the primary branch of government, the dominant branch of government. They created an independent executive only to have a check against what they thought was going to be an all-powerful legislature, since Congress is in the Article 1 of the Constitution, executive branches in Article 2. And in Article 2, the executive really doesn't have that many enumerated powers. Most of them, including in national security and foreign policy, are mostly in the executive, in the congressional branch. Now, also, the founders wanted more power to be in the states actually than in the federal government, because they wanted the federal government to have more powers than the Articles of Confederation, which went before. But they really, they had the 10th Amendment, which said, if this is not enumerated to the federal government, the powers will go to the states or the people. So they want, in the scheme of things, the states and then the Congress were supposed to be the dominant players. But what we have now, after over 2 centuries of history here, we have power migrating to the executive and the Supreme Court, the other 2 branches, which are not supposed to be as prominent, and away from the states and away from Congress. Now, part of this problem, we'll just discuss it right now at the federal level, problem with the recent past, and I would say the erosion of power probably started around the Spanish-American War, around the turn of the 20th century. And throughout all these wars that we've had in the 20th century, because we had more wars, many more wars than we had in the 19th century, the power in war always goes to the executive, because the executive is a hierarchical organization within the executive, whereas Congress, you have 435 House members and 100 senators. You have 535 people total. It's like herding cats. So when war comes along, the Congress was originally supposed to have the power to declare the war, to initiate the war, and then the executive would just come along as commander-in-chief, very narrowly focused, would conduct the war that the Congress had declared. Well, as time went on, these wars concentrated the power in the executive branch because of executive usurpation, but also because Congress willingly gave up its power. They had found that, individuals getting reelected was the important thing instead of legislating or whatever. And of course, we have that in the extreme case now, where we have essentially celebrity legislators rather than real legislators passing laws or going the other way and deregulating, substantive policy questions. What we have is celebrity people who want to get reelected, and they don't want to declare war anymore, because that would be, they have to stick their fingers to the wind to see if they're going to get reelected. Is this going to be a popular war, or is it not going to be a popular war? So we've gone through all this history, especially in the 20th and now the 21st century, of the power accruing to the presidency. So around probably, I think Truman was probably the first imperial president. For the first time in US history for a major war, he just decided, well, I'm not going to declare war in the Korean War. And so he went to war unilaterally.
Could that be because we abrogated our sovereignty to the United Nations?
Well, that's part of it, because he regarded the United Nations as, they approved it. So the Congress really didn't need to. That's one reason. And also, this rationale has gone forward. The Bushes and the Iraqs always said, well, hey, we got a UN resolution already. So, hey, Congress, you need to go along with this. But of course, the UN is really irrelevant to our Constitution. And the Congress is the most important okay to go to war. So what we've seen over these, over the 20th and 21st centuries now has been really a migration of constitutional powers in three areas to the executive. The first one is the war power, which we've been discussing. The second one is the treaty power. And now executives, they don't get treaties anymore because you have to get 2/3 of the Senate to agree to a treaty. And that's for, that's a high standard. So what they do is they get an executive agreement, make an executive agreement between the executives of some country or countries and the US, and then they'll either take it to Congress with a lower standard. They have to only get 50% in both houses, 50+1 in both houses to pass it, which is a lower standard than 2/3 in the Senate. Or in some cases, they don't get congressional approval at all. And some of these I shouldn't call them treaties, executive agreements are secret. So we don't know what they're agreeing to. And this has become the practice. So the treaty power is the second one. And the third one is the budget power. We now have a unified executive branch budget, and it's massive. And of course, they have all these executive bureaucracies. 99% of all federal employees are in the executive branch. The Congress has small staffs compared to that. And the Supreme Court has a few people for staff as well. But the bulk of the government and the resources are in the executive branch. And what happens is all these agencies makes their budget and sends it to the Office of Management and Budget, which is in the executive office of the president. And then, they'll quibble with the agencies, and then they send it to Congress as a unified document. Well, the Congress doesn't have the staff or the time to really get into the budget. So they putter around at the edges, usually paying attention to, breast cancer research or something like that, which is, of course, important, but it has nothing to do with defense or whatever you're doing the defense budget. So, the major issues are decided in the executive branch, and the Congress just putters around on the federal budget. And the reason I mentioned the budget is kind of boring, but you can't do anything in the government or anywhere else without money. And that's where we, so the treaty power, the budget power, and the war power, those are just three major areas where the power has gone over to the executive branch. And of course, this is all extra constitutional. In other words, it's not really kosher.
It's interesting, you talk about Congress reasserting itself. I was talking to Senator Toomey from Pennsylvania, and I told him that the Constitution, because he was talking about the overreach of the US Supreme Court, and I told him that the Constitution says that Congress can limit the jurisdiction of the Supreme Court. So therefore, if you don't like the rulings of the Supreme Court on, for example, abortion and many other issues, you could actually take their ability to even rule on the subject away from them. Also, the Constitution says that the president becomes the commander when called into service by the Congress, when called into service. So until he's called into service by a declaration of war, he's not commander in chief. And so if what you're saying is correct, and it is, in my opinion, all the things that we've done in the 20th century, starting with World War II as the endpoint, and everything since then, every war has been totally illegal, and almost every bill passed has been totally unconstitutional because it isn't covered by Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, the enumerated powers of the Congress. And
Yeah, I would agree with you totally. Yeah, the executive branch, and now we have a situation where not only the Congress is um, legislating outside this narrow Article 1, Section 8 of responsibilities for the federal government. Most stuff was supposed to be still with the states and usurping state powers. We haven't been talking about that, these mandates that the Congress puts on states, and sometimes it funds it insufficiently, and sometimes they have what they call unfunded mandates, where the federal government will tell the states, well, you do this, but you fund it yourself. So this is the Congress is clearly unconstitutional in legislating in those areas. But now what we have goes even further, and that is a lot of times, because we have congressional loggerheads with the extreme partisanship that we have now, there's no legislation. So the executive branch just says, well, if you ever hear a president say this, your ears should perk up, because they usually say, well, Congress is not doing anything. Congress is failing to act. So I have a pen, as Obama said, and I'm going to, just do this. Well, that's executive fiat. That's what dictators do. And that should not be happening. The only executive orders that the president should be issuing are ones to implement, telling the bureaucracy to implement the laws that the Congress have passed, and they shouldn't go out of that. But of course, they've gone way beyond that. We just had
a good example of that would be if Congress passed a law that we need to order a certain amount of rifles. It would be within an executive order power to order bullets for the rifles, because bullets are necessary when you have rifles. So that goes right along with that power. But what has happened is presidents will do anything they want, exactly like Mussolini or Hitler with the enabling acts. And it's no different here. It's the same thing.
Yes, and we don't realize that this is really not kosher, because executive fiat, why do we have a republic at all if we're just going to let the executive do things like this? We had the case of Biden just forgiving student loans, and now the courts have halted it. But presidents have done that before, but that doesn't make it right. The other problem that we have is precedent. One president will do something that's unconstitutional or illegal, and then because he did it, the next president will go, well, the president before me did it, so it's okay, and nobody says anything, right? Well, it's okay, that's a precedent. So we have a big problem with not catching bad presidents and wrapping the knuckles of the president and saying, don't do that again. We just failed to do that, and then they say, well, you didn't tell me I couldn't do it. So, and that was the case with the Korean War when Truman did that. Now, of course, we've never seen another declaration of war after World War II, because they didn't catch him when he did it in the Korean War.
Yeah, it's unfortunate. Where did you get your knowledge from? Was it from some school that I don't know about, or was it on your own? Are you an autodidact?
Well,
private.
No, most of this comes from just reading, the founding documents and coming to realize that I worked in Congress for 15 years, and my job was to investigate the executive agencies. And I originally would go out and find all this stuff wrong. And then I went a step further. I'm going, why are these agencies doing this in the first place? I work mainly in the national security area with the Defense Department, State Department, CIA, other intelligence agencies, those sorts of things. But the bureaucracies in these places, just like the bureaucracies at HHS or HUD, the domestic bureaucracies. So I began to say, well, what is, is this even, then I went another level, is this even constitutional? And of course, you go back to the original Constitution and you don't really find any federal role in health or education or any of these areas. And the federal government has just assumed this, but those were originally, if we did anything at all, it was at the state government level. And it wasn't the federal government wasn't supposed to go outside that enumerated area, which you mentioned, Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution lists all these things specifically that the federal government is supposed to do. And then the 10th Amendment says, which is now moribund, they asked Scalia, who's supposed to be, a conservative justice, and he said, "Oh, that's moribund." And I'm thinking, well, and I don't, it shouldn't be. It is. He was right. It was, but it's, it says if the federal government it's not listed, then it should go to the states or the people. So, what do you do? That's right in the Constitution, but most of what the federal government does is unconstitutional, I think.
Sure. I told you earlier that I'm a lawyer, and I was a completely ignorant individual, 100%, until I began to read the New American Magazine. And that's what taught me about the Federalist Papers and what they say, and the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution and the writings of the founders. Without the New American Magazine, I'd be as ignorant as everybody else. And that is very angering to me, because I don't like to pay for law school and get ripped off and not get what I'm supposed to get. And unfortunately, today, there are very few places where you can learn this, whether it's Austrian economics in the economic departments, or it's the Constitution in the law schools or in the colleges. In fact, recently they gave a civics test to the Ivy League students, and like the average score was 50%. And it was a test that I could have passed after reading the New American as a high school student. So the top students are so low now. And I always say I could beat LeBron James in basketball if you make the basket only 6 inches off the ground. So they've lowered the standard to such a degree that an imbecile becomes a genius.
Yes, you're right. I mean, the education on this stuff is, and one of the reasons I think is because we've gone so far beyond the Constitution that it's hard for anybody who really wants to teach it, because you have to say, well, much of what the federal government does is unconstitutional. Most of what you just said, most of the wars we've done since World War II have been illegal. And then we get into, problems that people don't want to hear that. And, people usually, the public usually get what it wants. So I think part of it is the public just doesn't want to hear some of this stuff. And so teachers, and maybe we're just so far removed from, our reality is so far different from what the founders had intended and, implemented at the beginning of the country's history, that it just seems, you seem like you're crazy if you say stuff like this, right? But it's really true.
Yeah, well, the Constitution was based on both a Christian view of original sin and man's evil nature. And even in Judaism, they don't say original sin, but they say evil inclination, which is not that far away. And so they knew, as Jefferson said, that men are not angels, and therefore we have to bind them down with the chains of the Constitution. But what they didn't realize, in my opinion, the founders, people tend to think that others are going to think the way they do. And they didn't realize that people today would not have close to the character that the founders had. We just don't have a lot of people with character anymore. They can't even show up on time. They can't even be where they promised to be. They can't even adhere to a contract, even though they signed it. And so when you have a lack of character, truth is out the window. I don't know what your view is on that.
Well, the founders did say that for a republic to survive, the individual citizens had to have virtue, and they meant civic virtue, which is, I think, exactly what you're saying as well, both personal virtue and civic virtue to get the job done, because it depends, and truth, it depends on truth, and we can agree on the facts, and we can disagree on opinion about what needed to be done, as long as it's within the Constitution. But we have to have the agreement that after we say, okay, we had this vote in Congress, then everyone has to be on board to, implement that and not go off running off and either seceding from the union or overthrowing the government or whatever.
The only congressman that I've seen who consistently follows your prescription, as outlined in the book, is Congressman Thomas Massie of Kentucky. I don't know if you're familiar with him.
Yes, I belong to an organization called the Empire Salon, and he's worked with us a number of times on the war. They write up things for Congress and resolutions and that sort of thing. And he's worked with that organization a number of times on this, especially on the war power issue.
Trump called him a, quote, cheap grandstander when he refused to vote for an unconstitutional bill. He was a cheap grandstander. And you may remember Bush's remark when he said, stop throwing that piece of paper in my face. You remember that one?
Mm-hmm.
He was referring to the Constitution.
Right. Yeah. Well, some of our presidents are not too familiar with the document when they take office. And, even I would even argue that Obama wasn't, and he was he taught a law class for a while. Yeah. So just the problem that you were mentioning earlier, that the constitutional lawyers haven't done much to support the Constitution over time.
Now there are people who consider themselves, or at least promote themselves as, quote unquote, conservatives, and they want to have a constitutional convention. And only God knows what if today a constitution were to be changed, what they would put into that document. There'd be all kinds of mandatory transgender firing. Every freak show in the world would be implemented. And they want, it's bad enough that we're not following it. And besides that, why would you want to have a new constitution if you already know that the people and the elected officials don't follow the one we have? So why would they follow a new one?
Well, I think that's a problem. You really have seen the societal erosion. Laws are on paper unless you have the societal norms under them so that people agree to follow them. Most people think murder is illegal and stealing other people's things illegal, or committing fraud, those three things. But some stuff that's law, people really don't follow it. And, they should either follow it, or they should change the law or amend the Constitution or whatever. But those norms, I think, have broken down to a certain extent in certain areas. And I think that's right. The law is only as good as the societal agreement underneath the laws. So the majority, well, not a majority, but like an overwhelming number of people follow the law, and you only have to put a few people in jail that don't get the message.
Yeah. Do you teach somewhere, or what do you do now on a full-time basis?
Well, I used to teach at both the University of Maryland and George Washington University. I taught international economics and trade at University of Maryland, and then I taught a class at George Washington University called War in the American Presidency. And you find when you teach the wars that all of this big government comes out of war. like for, as a trivial example, daylight savings time is the most ridiculous thing in the world, right? But it came out of World War One, trying to save energy. Well, our healthcare system, why do businesses provide healthcare system for their employees? Shouldn't they just have a system that, it's like any other thing you buy? My company, I work for a think tank, by the way, in California, but I get my health insurance, as most Americans do, through their where they work, but it's sort of an inefficient system. Well, how did this occur? Well, it occurred during World War II, when there was first of all, prices were being bid up, and so they had price inflation, as they do during most wars. So they put price controls, which led to rationing and everything. So all businesses, there was a labor shortage because there were millions of people conscripted into the military to go fight. So they had to, the businesses had to compete not on salary, because the wages and prices were controlled. So they started offering fringe benefits like healthcare. So that's how our healthcare system came, where your employer gives you healthcare, because healthcare should really be sort of like any other good in the market that I need health insurance, so I just go out in the market and buy it. But most people, of course, get it from work, and that's why. So all these domestic things flow from wartime many times, and the government has really increased after every war, and it goes back a little bit after the war is over, but it's the ratchet effect, and that's why we have a government that's massive, even a federal government. And even at the turn of the 20th century and beyond, the first couple decades, the federal government was only about 5% of the GDP, less than 5% actually. And now, of course, it's much greater. It's probably 25% or more now. I don't know what the exact figure is, but and then if you add the state government, you probably have over a third of the GDP is probably either federal or state government.
I'll ask that question of David Stockman when I interview him in a few days. He'll know because he was Reagan's budget director. Also, I wanted to bring up the fact that we had so many wars in the 20th century, and it coincides with the creation of a private bank called the Federal Reserve. Because without the Federal Reserve creating money out of thin air, how could we finance all these wars? This is what Ron Paul brought up so many times when he was a congressman. We wouldn't have the money for all these wars. It's bad enough with the Federal Reserve. Could you imagine if we had to tax people to fight all these wars?
Right. And I think, taxation is bad, but there are even worse ways to fund wars, and that is by heavy borrowing and by printing money. And that, of course, that's what the Federal Reserve does. That's the worst way of funding a war, is because it causes rampant inflation, even beyond what's usually caused by wars. So that's not the way to go. And yes, I think there's a lot to what he's saying there.
When Bernanke was appointed as the head of the Fed, Board of Governors, there was another guy from Colombia, I forget his name, but he was the guy in the running. It was between those two. And so he gave a speech at the Union League Club, and he was talking about what he would do if he became head of the Fed. So I raised my hand, and everybody else hid under the tables. And I said, what constitutional authority would you have to even exist? And he looked at me and he said, I don't know. At least he didn't know.
Yeah, that's right.
So,
yeah, well, that's the same like with the FBI. The FBI has no charter because it's not, federal law enforcement is not really authorized by the Constitution. That was always a state and local type of operation. But then you got gradually you had the FBI created, and it really doesn't have a charter.
Exactly. So how can people get your book, War in the Rogue Presidency?
Well, I guess the best way to do it is just go on Amazon, or they can contact the Independent Institute directly, which is the where I work. They published it, so you can get a copy from them as well.
And where are they located? In California?
Oakland, California. Yeah.
Okay.
Mhm.
You live in that area?
No. I did for a while, but then I moved to DC, and now I'm in Florida.
Ah, so you went down to DeSantis country.
Well, I still go up to DC a lot, so it's I'm still up in DC when I need to be there. So kind of works out well.
Well, Ivan Eland, I should say. It's been great having you. I wish you all the best. Unfortunately, you are in a minority, and certainly.
Yeah, I think I'm in an extreme minority.
My wife tells me that all the time. She has a PhD and a postdoctorate in medical sciences, and she teaches where students don't even know what the word ladder means. When you say former and ladder, they think it means something you climb.
Mhm.
That's how far down the drain we are. And so we've got to keep our faith in God, in my view, it's my opinion. And we have to confront falsehoods and evil wherever it is, regardless of popularity, regardless of your standing in the world economically. And we have to have people who will be like the Maccabees. You know about the Maccabees who revolted against the Greek Empire?
Yes. Mhm.
With the odds totally against them. They were a tiny ragtag group of very religious Jews who were not going to put up with the Greeks forbidding them from practicing their faith. And they would rather die than give in. And those are the type of people that started America, Patrick Henry, right? I know what course others may take, but as for me, give me liberty or give me death. And so hopefully your book, for those who want to be educated, will be a very important aid. And I recommend that everyone go out there and buy it for your high school student kids. Maybe they'll get an education that they're probably not going to get at any college that you spend all this money on, folks. So God bless and good luck with everything.
Thank you.
All right.
Thanks for having me on.
Okay, my pleasure.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.